What's up? What's up? Jarvis Nation, Darby here, and I'm joined today by Paige Velasquez Budde. Paige is a partner and CEO at Zilker Media, an Austin-based agency building people-driven brands. During her tenure as CEO, Zilker Media has been named one of the fastest-growing companies in Austin and best places to work for 2 years in a row by Austin Business Journal. Her approach to people-driven marketing has been featured in many media outlets, including Inc., Thrive Global, Texas CEO Magazine, Authority Magazine, Business News Daily, and Business.com. My goodness, Paige, you've got quite the list of accolades there. I am tongue-tied right now. Thank you so much for taking the time and coming and sharing with us how to be an awesome guest on podcasts. We got a lot of authors in our community here at Jarvis Underground, and a lot of people using books as lead magnets to generate more business, to get in front of more stages, and to increase their impact that they have in the world. So I'm stoked to be here and learn from you. Thank you so much for taking the time. Welcome, Paige.
Just really excited to dive in. This is going to just cover today one side of the PR component for authors, which is going to be podcast interviews. And really the reason why I'm so passionate about this topic is because for over a decade, our team at Zilker Media, we've had the honor really to do end-to-end branding for some of the world's top executives and thought leaders and companies and authors. So it's just been incredible to see how much that landscape has really shifted over time in terms of what is providing the most value for authors in terms of PR or a marketing strategy. So really over the next hour or so, really, I just want to try and cover as much ground as possible. And for the first portion of the conversation, I'm really just going to discuss where do podcasts fit in terms of today's landscape in the changing world of PR. And then the second half of the conversation, I'm going to get just more practical on how do you pitch podcasts to secure that guest spot, because I didn't want to leave that out since that's such an integral part of the process. And some people might be saying it's great once you land an interview, but how do you even get there? And then also really talk through how do you prepare and deliver an interview that makes an audience listening to the podcast want to go and visit your website after that interview? They want to go and buy your book, or they want to go and hire you for whatever service that you're offering. And so we're going to kind of touch on all three of those things today. Now, before we dive into everything podcast related, I really wanted to take a step back first and talk about the media landscape and just practically where are we today, and discuss where the PR and the podcast guest strategy fits in. Several years back, if you wanted to get a message out at scale, there were really only two ways to do that. And one was renting and buying coverage in an ad or a magazine or a billboard, or the second option was to get interviewed and earn your way onto a media outlet. Now, today, things are vastly different. We still have rented media and we still have earned media, but the biggest game changer and the opportunity for leverage for everybody and the authors moving forward is going to be the growth of what we call owned media. So first is rented media. The definition of rented media, these are going to be all the messages that go out where you fully control the content, but it lives on someone else's platform. So someone else actually owns the access to that audience. Advertising is the obvious one that lives up in rented media. You buy an ad, you control the content of the ad, but it goes out to an audience that someone else owns. Now, the other thing that lives up here is also going to be social media. And that's going to be your Instagram, your Facebook, your LinkedIn, your Twitter. Now, some people say, hey, I get why advertising is rented, but I don't get why social media is rented, because I own the connections. Those are my friends. Those are my peers. And really, we kind of learned the hard way that this is rented media. We had been working with a client, kind of at the beginning of the business Facebook page side, and we'd grown their page from 1,000 people to over 2 million people. And we were kind of posting and able to get just insane amount of engagement, insane amount of really just visibility and revenue from Facebook. And then one day, I believe it was in 2013, there was this switch, and some of you might remember this in the algorithm. And they shifted from an organic model to a pay-to-play model. And that's really where we started seeing, okay, we as Facebook truly own the access to your audience. And so now we're going to make you pay in order to access that audience moving forward. And that's why we have social media now in this rented category. Now, moving to the second portion over here is earned media. And this is where we will focus primarily our conversation on today. The definition of earned media is being invited onto someone else's stage or platform to deliver your message, which is just giving the audience the impression that you have earned that opportunity. So y'all are all probably most familiar with this one in the marketing space. It's going to include speaking and engagements. It's going to include PR, awards, client referrals. Now, because this category does more for credentialing you, most authors will typically lean towards putting all of their eggs in the earned media basket. But if all of your eggs are in this basket and your only focus is garnering earned media, the limiting factor is you do not have direct control in the category on whether or not your message goes out. You have indirect control in the fact that you can write a really good book or give a good interview. The problem is you just have to sit back and hope that that interview request comes in because someone else did something. So even though this is an important part of the strategy, this is why we're focusing our conversation here today. It's not where your marketing should end. So I want to be just really clear for authors that earned media is a very important category early on because of that credibility building factor. But over time, the focus has got to shift alongside rented media back to what we call owned media. And owned media is kind of that last portion down here at the bottom. The definition of owned media are going to be all the assets where you fully own the connection to your audience. So this is going to be your website, your email list, your blog, as well as your physical mailing list. And so the key here is how do we siphon off of audiences that we're being exposed to through rented media and through earned media opportunities, and how are we bringing them down to join that owned media audience, which is going to be the most important thing in terms of long-term success for authors in growing their business even after book launch. And so we're going to dive in and discuss this a little bit more when we get to the podcast interview specifics, but I thought it was really important just to cover that first before we dive in. Now, one of the biggest shifts that we've seen in the media landscape is we as consumers of media are increasingly moving our attention away from large generic media, really for two reasons. One, we're increasingly projecting bias and filters on what we're consuming. And two, the much more important, when we invest an hour of our time consuming large generic media, we only get a fraction of the value for our time investment. So, for example, our office is about a 30-minute commute from Austin. And so, every morning on my way into work, I would always listen to my favorite morning show, which is the Bobby Bones Show. And what I loved about this show is that the host didn't only cover country radio, which is what they were on the air for. They didn't really bring those celebrities in. They also brought the songwriters behind the songs and had them tell their stories. And so during that show, and I thought that was such a unique thing about them. And so most mornings I would invest probably, 30 minutes, 40 minutes to get one 10-minute segment on the songwriters. And so what I started doing was switching over from my radio and plugging in my phone and listening to the Bobbycast, which was hosted by the host Bobby Bones. And it was an hour of content, all from his favorite songwriters. And so now I've started to do the same thing in terms of leadership and marketing when consuming content. Now, when we look at PR, there are really two overarching categories that you should focus your PR strategy on for a more well-rounded approach. The first one is the one that we all know. This is going to be kind of our big banner name brand media. And this is typically what you think of when you hear PR. These outlets absolutely serve a purpose in your strategy, and that is to remarket these earned media opportunities to build credibility as an author. Now, these are going to be the logos that you're going to want to feature on the hero image on the homepage of your website. And these are the outlets that you're definitely going to feature in that biography. So when you have an introduction, those outlets read out. And back in the day, we really saw these kind of name brand, big banner media opportunities as the best way to sell and move books. But because of the changing landscape, we really don't see that happening the way it used to, because the way people consume media is starting to shift moving forward, and the trustworthiness is starting to shift. So now what's happening is we're increasingly redeploying our attention away from large generic media to now what we call micromedia. And micromedia are individuals that we perceive as more trustworthy and entertaining than what we can consume from mass media or name brand media. Now, these outlets have extremely loyal and niche following. And so micromedia, these are going to be your podcasts, your blogs, your trade publications, your newsletters. And we tend to see now much more movement in terms of sales or lead generation with these audiences because they are so niche and powerful. And that's really been a big shift in landscape that we've seen in the past 5 years in terms of what is truly most valuable to authors. Okay, we understand where podcasts fall in the landscape. We understand where podcasts fall in the strategy, but how do you get that interview? How do you secure that? Some of you might be thinking, okay, it's great to learn right now how to be a great podcast guest, but how can I even get on a show to begin with? And so up here on this slide is kind of the formula that you can use to help craft your email outreach or your pitch to the podcast you'd like to be featured on. So this is kind of the formula that you want to use to pitch yourself to a show. Now, another thing to think about is, okay, who do I even send this to? You want to look for on a podcast, you want to look for a host contact. You also want to look for a producer contact. So if they have both listed, you want to pitch the producer first. They're more likely the ones that are going to be looking at all the applications. They're going to be the ones that are kind of sifting through that and deciding, okay, does this make sense for our long-term strategy or what we're discussing or the themes of the podcast? If they don't have a producer, the host is the next best person to send that email to. The key is to this outreach email template is that it is simple and that it leads with value. So one of the first things here that she pointed out is we really led with the author's credentials in the subject line. So this is really key to immediately catching the attention of a podcast producer or a host. And so you want to credential as much as possible up front in your pitch. One key thing to keep in mind are producers, they're typically getting hundreds, if not thousands of pitches in their inbox a day if they have, a pretty decent following in terms of subscribers to the podcast. So when Crafting an email, you really want to keep it short and easy to read. So notice here how our publicity director really bolded some of this key information in the pitch, the things that she thought would stand out the most to that host. She also kept the paragraphs just really concise and used, different strategies such as bullet points just to deliver the value succinctly. One thing to really point out is this pitch is less than 250 words, which is incredibly short, but it's all about keeping it concise, delivering value, and really focusing on, how can we make this an easy format to read. Now, if that host opens up that email and you have, 5 4-sentence paragraphs for that email, they're going to delete it because they truly just don't have time to read it. And you're probably just throwing information at them. You really want to avoid giving that producer or that host a reason to delete your email. So keep it clear, keep it value driven, do your research on the podcast and really understand what's going to be most appealing to them in terms of conversation and talking points that you're sharing with them to really have it be concise and value driven. Now, at the end of the pitch, one thing I also wanted to point out that our publicity director did is she used bullet points just to clearly lay out potential conversation areas that would create an interesting conversation for that show. And so you have to ensure that you are customizing these for each show. So we always recommend that you at least listen to one episode, if not two, to really get a feel for what's going to be most valuable based on the topics that they're covering, based on the interview style that that host has as well. And now that we've walked through kind of what that live pitch example looks like, that secured an interview, I want to touch on really quickly what you should absolutely avoid in your pitch to podcasters. I think that's just as important as what you should do. You really don't want to come across as overly promotional with a bunch of jargon. And that's the mistake that we see most. Really watch your language to ensure you're not using overused words and really focus on credentialing and delivering value. So this list here on the screen that I have is the most overused words in press releases from 2021. And I kind of laugh just when looking at these because I feel like there's some of those that we've heard a lot this year, especially unprecedented. Other ones that we kind of see a lot are thrilled and cutting edge. We want to avoid using those as much as possible. Those don't make you stand out. You really want to lead with factual credentialing as much as possible.
We have a quick question before we continue on here regarding to pitching the podcast. From Linda asks, just wondering how would you pitch, how you'd pitch a podcast when you have to use a contact form on their website rather than sending an email. Any tips there?
Yeah. I would do as much investigating as possible to try and find an email that you can directly use for your outreach. That's obviously going to be the best way to stand apart. But there definitely are some that say, okay, this is the only way you can submit. Typically, in an email, or in a contact form, what I would do is you kind of have the demographic information that you fill out with your name and contact information. And then you have an area to share a little bit more of why you think you'd be a fit for the show. And so that's when I would do kind of a one-liner, a one sentence, that's kind of your subject line. And then I would craft kind of the same exact pitch that we talked about, especially this template kind of going back here. I would use this exact template within that contact form. And we've definitely pitched on contact forms. Another thing that you can do that we always recommend our clients to do, and our brand strategy team does a really good job at, is not only pitching, but also on the Renton Media side, so your social media channels, especially Twitter, because it's a relationship building platform. Reach out and start organically building a relationship with that podcast producer or that podcast host.
Mhm.
That's so important when it comes to, you want to have kind of that warm introduction before you just start pitching yourself. And so
Mhm.
if you can start following them, if you could start, even sharing some of the episodes and, retweeting and commenting what you found most insightful. Podcast producers, and this is the same for any type of media you're pitching, but podcast producers, they get, especially for bigger shows, hundreds and thousands of pitches in their inbox a day, or their submission forms a day. But they're not getting thought leaders, authors that are organically interacting with them
Mhm.
on Twitter and receiving that direct notification to their phone. And so it's kind of a two-way street in terms of some of these strategies working together. But you can absolutely pitch over, we've definitely submitted over a contact form, but as much as you can, do your research and try to find an email.
Yeah.
Now, once you craft your pitch, and of course, avoiding all the jargon that we talked about, and you receive that email back that you have landed the interview, the big question is, how do you prepare yourself to be a great podcast guest? Now, there are really three areas to focus on to truly be a good podcast guest. And the first one is going to be kind of more of that pre-interview stage. The second area we're going to focus on is the actual podcast interview. And then the third is the post-interview follow-up. So during the pre-interview stage, there are a few things to really check off your list to prepare you for the interview. Now, the biggest shift that we have seen in podcast interviews, especially after the pandemic and during the pandemic, and truly what I want to warn all of you about is to be prepared for video. So many podcasts, which you have thought, okay, that's probably audio only, they've been moving to recording video in addition to audio. Now, one thing that you can do ahead of the interview is ask the host or producer, hey, is this interview going to include video recording? Now, sometimes I've had this happen. I've hopped on a podcast where the host likes to have the video on during the interview, just simply so that you can look at each other during the conversation. Other times, podcasters, they really might just use a portion of the video just for promotional purposes, but the main long form content goes out on audio. And some of them release the whole video on YouTube and other social media platforms, and they're stripping the audio for podcast syndication. So always make sure your video ready. You have good lighting. Your background is appropriate. You don't want anything probably too busy in your background. You also don't want to be sitting, directly where there's light coming in from a window. And so one thing just to always do, no matter if they mention this or not, explicitly ask the producer ahead of time what to expect. Are they going to be recording the video? Are they going to want the video on during the interview so that you can be prepared? Or else your face might look like the one that you see here on the screen when you realize that they're actually recording the video. And I can speak from personal experience. It's happened to me when I did an interview during COVID, and I didn't quite have my hair or my makeup the way I wanted to, and now that video lives on forever. And so you really want to avoid having this kind of face whenever you log on and realize, oh no, this is going to be recorded. So always be prepared for that, and explicitly ask for that. That's completely okay. Also, in the pre-interview stage, many podcast hosts typically require a 15 to 20-minute pre-interview call. Don't be afraid of this call. All it means is they're trying to ensure that you and the host have the right chemistry. Also, that you can kind of establish a relationship before it's time to record. Sometimes it's just general conversation. Sometimes they might want to hone in a little bit more on the themes that you want to cover during the interview. So don't be intimidated by this at all. This can also be a good opportunity just to test out your equipment. if they're going to be doing a pre-interview call over the platform that they record on, and a lot of them do. And so it's important just to invest if you're going to be doing a lot of podcasts in a good pair of earphones. I have the AirPods. You can also have a strong mic or a podcast mic, kind of like there's one here behind me in the room. Those always produce pretty good audio. Another thing that you can do to prepare for an interview is really get a sense of the type of questions that are going to be asked. So listen to past interviews. That's the best way to learn that. If you follow the template for pitching that we just went through, you probably already listened to at least one episode to craft that pitch. It's really great to listen to a few episodes ahead of an interview to get a sense of the host style and the types of questions they ask. A lot of times they're pretty similar, interview to interview. One big misconception of PR is that you're always going to see the questions ahead of time. Now, some hosts or producers will send the questions ahead of time, but this is truly the exception. It's not the rule. So most podcasters, they want it to be an organic, long form conversation. So you should never ask for the questions if they're not offered up to you from the host. Now, the last thing to do ahead of the interview is to get a backup number from the host or from the producer, just in case your dial-in or just in case the Zoom or whatever platform you're working off of doesn't work, or the internet goes out in the middle of the interview. It's always great to have that. It's also helpful to give them your cell phone number in case there's any issues connecting. You can always reach out to each other directly and avoid having to reschedule due to tech issues. So this happens so often now, and it really just saves the interview and shows you're a true professional if you go in with a plan B. Now, when you kind of get to the interview portion of the podcast, there are really only a few things that you need to keep in mind because you've done so much prep ahead of time. This should be really the most fun and exciting and easy part of the process. Now, one thing to ensure is that you have all of your apps on your computer or your phone notifications, everything shut down. The last thing that you or that podcast host wants is a notification sound going off during the recorded conversation. So one thing to help enhance the quality of your sound is to put yourself in what we call a soft room. And so think of if you can find a room with certain surfaces like carpet or that has wall decor, furniture, anything that can absorb the sound. An area you don't want to be in is concrete, hard tile, glass walls. Those all tend to create an echo. So really focus on finding an area that can be your podcast, your soft room, to avoid any of that. Most podcast interviews, they typically range 30 minutes to an hour, which is truly categorized as long form content. So you want to do everything you can to keep up the energy during this time. So we recommend for a lot of our clients that you smile during the interview. Even if it's audio only, this impacts the tone and it impacts the energy that you have throughout the interview. Some of our clients also like to stand up, if it makes sense. I've seen a lot of presenters, especially virtually, they want to stand up because that helps keep the energy up. So whatever you have to do during this long form content to keep your energy up, make sure you're doing that. Now, I'm going to get to the most important part now, which is at the end of the interview. The most important thing to remember is to plan and deliver an interesting call to action. Remember at the very beginning, of this session, we talked about the media landscape and really getting a podcast interview is great, But the long-term value is to drive these listeners that you've been exposed to back to what we call that owned media audience. So that's going to be your website. That's going to be having them sign up for your email list. Then you have the opportunity to nurture them into buying a book. A lot of times they're not going to be ready for that immediate conversion. So you have to think, how can I get them in my email list and extend that interaction over time? Podcast hosts, at the end of almost every interview, if not all interviews, ask the folks, typically, they say, hey, where can everybody go to learn more about you? So instead of just pointing people towards your website, towards your social media channels, towards your book, you want to point them towards that compelling call to action. So for example, promote a free downloadable, promote a quiz that will give the podcast listeners a compelling reason to go visit your website and truly join that email list to be added on to that owned audience. The call to action that we're seeing a lot of success in right now is pointing people towards a quiz on a website, which is going to be that interactive content. So instead of me giving you something that you think is valuable in the form of that free download, you give me something that I think is valuable, which is going to be free personalized feedback through that quiz or assessment. Now, this interactive thought really came to us several years back when we worked on a book with authors Katty Kay and Claire Shipman. It was called The Confidence Code. It was all about closing the confidence gap between men and women in the workplace. And so the authors, they had this idea that they wanted to partner with a research firm and create a quiz that individuals could come into their website, answer questions to determine how confident they were in the workplace. And then from there, what were the steps they could take to become more confident? So we got this quiz back and saw it was 55 questions long. And we said, oh my gosh, I don't know if this is going to work. This is such a long quiz. It's so in depth. But the authors really pushed for it. And we're so glad that they did, because there's now been over 200,000 people that have taken it over the past few years. And so what happens, and the reason why this was so successful and why their strategy was so integral, is at the end of every interview that they did, when they were tossed that softball question by the host of where can our audience go to find more information, instead of just saying, hey, our new book is out, go to Amazon to purchase it, or go to our website to find more, what they would say was, I'm sure a lot of your audience members are curious with how confident they are. We get this question so often that we've set up a free confidence quiz on our website. If you go to our website, you can take it there. And so the way you answer that softball question at the end of that interview for your podcast determines how many people are going to get up and leave that interview and go to your website to learn more and to sign up for your email list. And they may not be ready to actually buy your book yet, or reach out to you to hire you for whatever your service or your product might be, but they're pretty interested in, for example, how confident they are. And then over the course of taking that assessment or that quiz, once they land on your website, what's going to happen is you actually answer all the questions and get a response based on how you've answered those questions. So for example, in this scenario, it might be, it looks like you've got medium confidence. Don't worry about it. You know what? We started much lower confidence than you are right now. Here are the 5 things that you can do to focus on the next 30 days that's going to improve your confidence. And then if you want to go deeper on this, here's a link to specifically download this chapter from our book that deals with this specifically. So now what you're trying to do after they take the quiz, and of course they're putting in their email to take the quiz, which is joining your email list, what you want to try to do from there is kind of work them down a funnel towards buying your book or hiring you for your services or buying your product. But the key thing here is you have to extend, or you have to find a way to extend your interaction over time with a much larger group of people than just trying to go in cold and directly selling to them. And so one of the biggest things I want to encourage each of you to think about is, what is that right call to action for your podcast interviews that is going to lead people towards your website, and it's going to lead you to the opportunity of getting to nurture them, getting to teach them, instead of just trying to sell to them and have them go to Amazon to buy the book directly from that interview, because your conversion is going to be extremely higher with pointing towards the quiz mainly. And of course, you mentioned your book, of course, you mentioned that it's available, but that direct call to action is going to be higher in terms of conversion if you are giving them something valuable to begin with, where you have an opportunity to nurture them long term. Now, once you've completed the interview, there's still very important work to do. And your goal as a guest is to build a long-term win-win relationship with that podcast producer and host. So a lot of work needs to happen after the interview. One of the best things you can do to support a show is leave an Apple Podcast review. So this is what actually boosts the show rankings and credibility of the show in Apple's algorithm. And so podcast producers and hosts absolutely notice this. We've actually had some individuals, and sometimes our team goes in and actually rates the interview before we even pitch them, or rates the podcast before we even pitch them, because we've been listening to it to really understand what's the best approach for outreach. So this can happen before you pitch a podcast. This can also happen after you're a guest on the show as well. You also want to be really intentional with how you share your interview once it goes live. Now, I know for some of you, it might feel extremely uncomfortable to share your interview on your personal social media channels. And I know you probably don't want it to come off as overly promotional, but it is absolutely vital and so important to the show and its success that you share your interview with your audience. And so our recommendation is to share it twice on social media channels and tag the show and tag the host. One way to do it so that it doesn't feel overly promotional or awkward is to just wax on about the show and the host and the conversation that you had and how valuable it was for you, if you feel uncomfortable talking about yourself. Now, I also recommend pushing it out to your email list and adding it to your website as well, just to truly maximize that reach. And so this can lead to new listenership for the show. It could show a lot of goodwill towards the host as well. And so one thing to keep in mind is, you never know down the line, they might want to have you back on the show, or they might invite you to become a recurring guest. So think strategically of how you can promote it on your platforms and within your network. It's also really important for you to stay in touch with the producer or the host of the show. Be sure to sign up for their newsletter or follow them on social media like we talked about earlier. Share their content every once in a while, even if it's not your interview, and really comment on what you're seeing, extremely valuable from them. Also, you never know where these relationships can lead down the line. You know, they might hop over, if it's a producer, to another show. So really focus on cultivating that even outside of the interview. The biggest thing to remember is getting media exposure through a podcast is an extremely important portion of your PR strategy, especially when it comes to making sure that you have that well-rounded strategy with Micromedia included. But remember, it's only a portion. And then your entire earned media or PR strategy is only a portion of the full marketing strategy. So at the end of the day, the goal is to drive these opportunities towards growing that owned audience with the right call to action at the end of the interview for that long-term success. Now, I do want to take some time just to share with you all our new PR subscription offering, and this is something that is new for us. We're actually launching it before end of year, which is really exciting. It's an online program that was created by our PR team to help authors and thought leaders pitch themselves to high value podcasts. So this is a great way to garner your own PR coverage with the help of a PR team and the support of a PR team. This is a subscription-based service. It includes 2 emails a month, and they each feature 5 hand-picked podcasts for you to pitch. We actually have you put in just specific information that we need in order to curate this for you. This email also includes detailed contact information, so the producer, the host, exactly who to pitch, and then insider tips and background information on how to successfully pitch each producer. So our team has had relationships with these producers and these hosts for several years, and these are podcasts, that some of our clients have been on as well. And so just giving y'all that background information of how to specifically craft your pitch, and from there how to deliver something that's going to be a win. And so we'll be launching this service soon. Please email me, which I'm going to put up here in a minute, if you would like to get on our wait list. So we are curating that right now. We're also offering the first month free when you sign up for a 3-month and a 6-month subscription. One thing I'm also doing is giving you all a download from the Podcast Guest Insider program that outlines a podcast guest checklist. So a lot of those details that we went over and we covered today. Darby, Zachariah, they both have that, and they're going to be sending that out. And you guys are the first group to see this. And so excited to share that with you specifically. I also have our website here, zilkermedia.com. You can actually take the quiz to see where your brand is in terms of that media landscape right now. And then another offering that we're happy to do is just a 30-minute free PR consultation. So happy to take a look at the way you're positioning yourself in terms of your bio, or maybe some of the pitches that you've crafted, and really strategically how to shift those moving forward. And so just to schedule that, you'll email paige@zilkermedia.com. Also, to get on our wait list, you'll email paige@zilkermedia.com, and we'll be sure to get you guys on there.
Paige, thank you so much for that. Was a waterfall of great tips for anyone getting into the podcast game and wanting to use it to grow their authorship platform. Anyone that's already been in the podcasting game or has a book or multiple books, wants to get their books featured more. At the end of the day, these are all aspects of your marketing. You really want to own your customer or your relationship, right? You want to own your website. You want to own your email. You can go find Paige at paige@zilkermedia.com. Email her there. We'll be sending out some freebies that she put together for us. Any final words before we sign off your Paige?
No, just for anybody that needs, a sounding board, more than happy to jump on a call and walk through some of that and point you in the right direction. And two, I love what you guys are doing. So I just appreciate, you bringing me on just to be part of the conversation and looking, kind of forward thinking of what is publishing and what does writing a book look like. And I'm so fascinated by it all.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We are going to sign off now. Thank you, Linda, and everyone else signing on with us.